Now let's look at what is a Chypre fragrance or a Chypre, or there are different ways to pronounce this. Chypre, Chypre, okay, or some people call it Chypre, Chypre, okay. Now this is basically a fragrance family, okay, which is basically got predominantly four notes that it will generally have. Okay, it will generally have bergamot, oak moss, patchouli, and labdanum, which are mostly rock, mossy, woody kind of a vibe, and that is the generally the type of fragrance. This is a good example of it would be, let's say for example, Calvin Klein one, or Tom Ford's Noir de Noir. Okay, these are good examples of this kind of fragrance. Even Rojas the Chypre is a very nice fragrance. It doesn't mean that they will have only these four things. They will actually have a lot of things, but these four things are very prominent on this, or they're kind of built around this, right? So there is no hard bound rule to say that these are exactly like this. Dior's Eau Sauvage, for example, Timeless 4 is also a very good example of what a Chypre fragrance is, okay, because it'll have those green vibes, it'll have those mossy vibes, plus it'll have those citrus element and all of that. So this is one example of that, or a good example of what a Chypre fragrance is. My knowledge in this is probably very limited and low. Probably somebody who is been into fragrance for a long time, especially somebody who is dealing with a lot of niche fragrances, would be able to give you very good insight on this. Like I said, this is a very basic information about this. Whereas a fougere is basically a fragrance that will have like a fern is basically your green element kind of a vibe, like your typical, your florals, your oriental spices, woody, Chypre, gourmand, fruity fragrances. Most fragrances that we see would be aromatic fougeres that you would see. If you look at any fragrance, mostly they will say this, it will say it's a aromatic fougere, because most of the fragrances fall under this category, because they will definitely have some element of fresh green, woody character to it, right? So these elements are there, right? So these are generally the case. One good example of a very good fougere would be, I think, ThePerfumeExperience. Okay, I think ThePerfumeExperience is a very good example of this, and it works really well. Boss by Hugo Boss, Prada for Men, Paco Rabanne, all of these, Eternity by CK, they're all examples of how a fougere fragrance is. But I would say don't get into too much into what is a Chypre fragrance and what is a fougere fragrance. But like I said, most of the time it is going to be built in this. There are a lot of aromatic fougeres as well, like Dior Sauvage and all of that, which is generally the case, right? So you don't have to worry much about it. But these are just a category of fragrances, like in the fragrance wheel. These are also categories of fragrances. What you really need to be worried or need to know is what is a designer fragrance and what is a niche fragrance. Okay, you will have heard this term designer, niche in some cases, or if you're starting your journey into fragrances, then this is something good to know, right? So designer is basically a brand that makes fragrances as part of its portfolio, right? For example, think about Hugo Boss. Now, Hugo Boss, for example, makes watches, makes shirts, makes accessories, makes perfumes. Think about Tom Ford, makes suits, makes apparels, makes fragrances. So like that, if you look at Calvin Klein, for example, makes clothes, makes watches, makes fragrances, makes accessories, right? Louis Vuitton, for example, they become more niche, but they are also a high-end designer in one way, because they also make a lot of, all of these things, right? The only difference is, like, when you think about brands, like especially when you think about, let's say, Hugo Boss or Calvin Klein, they're more mass appealing brands. But when you think about Louis Vuitton, or when you think about Givenchy, they are more premium, more high end luxury brands, right? So there's a way of segregation of that. Now, whereas niche, on the other hand, are basically houses of fragrances that only do fragrances. They don't do anything else, right? So, for example, if you look at MFK, Mrs. Francis Cordijan, they only make perfumes. They don't make anything else. Same thing with Roja. They only make fragrances, nothing else. So, niche is basically houses that are dedicated to making fragrances and not basically making anything else, right? Now, again, the word house is very, descriptive, or it could be different. Now, house is generally given to a term, like a mason is also called house in French, is given to in a brand or a house that deals with fragrances, who have their own perfumers, who have their own research center, they have their own manufacturing, they have their own sourcing and all of that, like your Amwaj, your Roja, all of that, because they kind of, they have their own people sitting and, working on creating fragrances day in, day out, and they have, master perfumers who help them, guide them to make fragrances, and, that's why they are given the title of house. Now, in most alt brands, we can't call them houses because they don't really create anything on their own. There is no originality there. They take a fragrance, they take the DNA of that particular fragrance. There are many ways to get those DNAs, and they replicate and copy paste and create something. So they cannot be really called as house. While I have described house, in the house series, I call these brands house because I've taken that context of defining that brand. But in real world, when you talk about a house will typically have its own master perfumer, the perfumers, the research center, the labs, the manufacturing, the sourcing, and a lot of things happening. That's why the word house. Okay. Now, for example, Ganymede is not made by a brand at all. Ganymede is made by somebody who's into apparels. They are actually a boutique which makes custom made clothes, but they have also created a fragrance, and so it's a little, sometimes the worlds kind of blend in between or cross paths, but mostly designers are separate, which is more mass appealing everyday use. Niche are houses which basically are created sophisticated, complicated things, and generally niche fragrances will go after getting the best of the ingredients. So a lot of times they use naturals. Okay. Now that's the next bit of the topic, which is to understand naturals versus synthetic and artisanal. Now a lot of people think that, okay, if I'm buying a clone, I'm getting synthetic vibe. Let me explain that almost everybody in the world, even your niche brands, also use synthetics because certain commodities or most commodities are not available in such large quantities for you to go ahead and create them, right? So you, like for example, lavender cannot orris butter, right, which is an extract of lavender, is not really going to be easy for you to create in mass capacity, because it takes 4 to 5 years to create that. So you have synthetic elements that can be replicating this compound, right? Now, very few fragrances, like for example Roja fragrances, you should watch the video of how Roja makes oud oil, right? So if you understand that, you will get a sense of how difficult it is to source natural components and make natural fragrances. For example, Taif rose is a rose that is, I think, from the region of Saudi, and that is only coming in 1 or 2 months time. It only comes for that small duration, so getting that source, getting that harvest is going to be very difficult for all the brands, right? So a lot of brands go between synthetic and natural. Mostly designers all use synthetic blends. Now what differentiates them versus a roadside shop is the quality of the blend. Okay, like how you have quality of ingredients, similarly you have quality of blends that can be compounds that can be created, that can last longer, that can be less harmful for your skin, and all of those things that are taken. The best of the best is taken by the bigger industry, and the lower quality is used by lower brands and so forth. Niche primarily try and get as much as naturals as possible, but it is again difficult. Okay, now this is another reason why in some brands or some perfumes you will see the note of oud, but then you will not get any oud vibe to it, because maybe they used very less. So but in the branding they would have put oud because oud kind of attracts people, right? So that is the way of marketing versus synthetic versus natural substances. Now, when we're talking about designer and when we're talking about niche, we also need to talk about one element. There are two worlds of fragrances. Your French world, which is your designer houses, and all of them make fragrances towards the Western style, which is your French perfumery. And then there is the Middle Eastern perfumery, which is basically your Oriental fragrances, your oud, your saffron, and all of that, which is used heavily through leather and all of that in the Middle Eastern side, which is your Middle Eastern fragrances. So typically you have French fragrances, then you have your Middle Eastern fragrances, then you have your Indian fragrances, which are basically your athars that are there, which are created of natural oils, right? So those are the next things to talk about. Now, athars and fragrance oils, for example, versus fragrances, what is the difference? The 15%, 20% concentration of fragrance that I was talking to you about, fragrance oils, are basically athars, right? So because you use attar and then you can add alcohol to it, make it a fragrance, spray fragrance, right? But fragrance oils are slightly different. Fragrance oils are basically one note fragrances, right? Basically, if you're taking oil of, let's say, jasmine, okay? Now, only using jasmine on your skin by itself is called a fragrance oil. So fragrance oils are available as well, which are basically one note commodities that you can buy. This is bought for you to experiment and see what works excellent for you. So is it something that you should try, or can you there are some people who like to experiment, who would like to put a drop of maybe jasmine and then put a drop of sandalwood and try and see how it works. But why people don't always buy fragrance oils and use them is because it's like making a recipe. You need a little bit of everything to make a good recipe, and that's exactly what happens in fragrance oils. Right, now I think we've kind of covered about 10 points. There are about a couple of more or few things that I will talk to you very quickly, and then we can try and come to a close on this particular thing. Let's quickly connect to the next part of it.